Sleepy Reader back. Part 3 of my long session of answering questions. Thanks again to everyone for asking the questions. It's a lot of fun. Silver Age Nostalgia has some very good questions. Starts by saying, when would you say you started reading and buying comic books? I guess, I got a very slow start sometime in the early 70s, and then it picked up steam. I figured out ways to get comic books, even though my parents weren't very keen on it, as I got a bit older. And so I guess I started reading and buying comic books when, really reading and buying comic books, maybe 1975, 76. 75 sounds about right. But I had got a few comic books before then. Then Silver Age Nostalgia asks, do you draw? And yes, I do draw. Very little these days, when I had more time on my hands. But I should go back. That very first comic book I got when I was 8 or 9 or whatever I was, I started drawing then. And that was, in my memory, the first time I really made any serious attempts at drawing, and I got very serious about it. And I used to lock my door in my bedroom and spend a lot of time copying superhero muscles and things like that. And then when I took sort of serious art classes in high school, I would always end up being the best at drawing the figures because of all the comic book drawing I'd done. And later in high school, I got really into painting and stuff. So comic books led me into doing a lot of art, and led me into an interest in artists a lot beyond comic books, which I didn't have before that. So I became very interested in, a lot of the Renaissance painters and things like that, and Goya, and then later interested in Pablo Picasso and various other people, all I think because of comic books. And then scattered throughout my adulthood, I would take life drawing classes and later just go to life drawing sessions, that artists would have in their studios where they'd hire a model, and everyone would pay $5 and now $10 or $15. But I don't do that so much anymore, just not a lot of time. I always found doing life drawing, just a fun release. And I think I got pretty good at life drawing, so I wish I had a life drawing here to show you. And I wish I had some of the old drawings I did as a kid, all the comic books I made, and they're all gone, all thrown away. Well, I think somewhere I have a drawing of Thor. I should dig that up. So yeah, it's very related to comic books, a lot of drawing in my life at times, but never really serious. Maybe I had a fantasy of being a comic book artist at some point, just briefly, but never pursued that. You have to be able to draw so many things beyond the human figure to be a good comic book artist, and I never really tried those other things. Are you a writer? And yes, but that doesn't have a whole lot to do with comics. I guess I once thought about being a comic book writer, I think in college, or maybe just after I graduated my senior year. I sent some plot ideas to Warren magazines that I think they were still around then. Or maybe it was something similar, somebody who published short horror stories. And I tried sending to them and got no response. And I, again, just like with drawing comics, I might have had a brief moment where I fantasized that I would become a comic book writer, although I think all my fantasies really were about being a comic book writer / artist, like Jack Kirby or Will Eisner or Frank Miller. But just from reading between the lines when I was in college, I sort of saw that everybody who wrote for comics at the time had worked in the editorial offices first, and I just never imagined I would go to New York and network my way to being a comic book writer. So I never seriously fantasized about that, but I did fantasize about being a science fiction writer, because I also read a lot of science fiction, and that seemed a more doable thing. And I've written on and off written science fiction, and I've published, I guess, I'm showing three fingers, four professional science fiction short stories that appeared in paying professional science fiction markets. But that's spread out over a period of 20 years, something I did not pursue with great ambition either. And I've had jobs that involve certain amounts of writing here and there, and currently have a job where I act as kind of an editor and kind of other things. So writing is definitely part of my life. And the science fiction critique groups that I've been in the past may affect the way I review comics, although I'm trying not ever to pretend I'm a professional reviewer, just because I think fans speaking to fans is much more valuable than anyone trying to set themselves up above as a professional reviewer. So you mentioned, and this relates to the previous questions really, I see a lot of books in the back, meaning the back of my videos. This is still all questions from Silver Age Nostalgia. I hope I mentioned that before. So all the questions so far in this segment have been Silver Age Nostalgia. Very good questions. So Silver Age Nostalgia asks, what regular books do you like to read? And I love to read science fiction, and fantasy too. Just pulled some right off the top of my shelf. There's a really cool fantasy series from a British writer, or maybe he's actually Canadian, but his stuff is published originally in Britain. Frederick Pohl, Gateway, Triton by Samuel Delany. So my second love after comic books probably is science fiction, but I always thought that I thought it would be easier to be a science fiction writer than a comic book writer, so I played with that a bit. And I also like some, I guess what you'd call literary writers. I really like Gabriel Garcia Marquez of 100 Years of Solitude fame. I went through a huge Charles Bukowski phase in my earlier days, in my 20s, but I still have a strong affection for him. And I like other writers who are kind of outsider writers, as opposed, when you talk about the literary mundane writers, as opposed to the establishment writers, like John Updike or something, although there's nothing wrong with his writing. So I hope that gives you a little flavor of what I read when I'm not reading comic books. Nowadays, my reading is mostly comic books, and then I listen to audiobooks on my commute back and forth to work. And I just don't seem to have comic books fit into my reading style better right now. I don't seem to have much time for reading books. As I've alluded to in other videos, just been past 5 or 6 years, just been such a busy time in my life, and a crazy time, and lots of twists and turns in my personal life and my career. So, great question, Silver Age Nostalgia. Super Slutsky 69, Super Slut 69. I thought that was a spam name, but this question is serious. What are your favorite series from each decade? So I'm going to even count the decades that I haven't, been alive in. In the 1940s, my favorite series would be The Spirit by Will Eisner, as I've mentioned in a previous video. He stands head and shoulders above. I mean, you can read him in any decade, and be amazed by him and by his artwork and his storytelling. The 1950s, I know that the best work was in those EC comics, but I don't know which title of those EC comics to pick. Other people are more knowledgeable on that. I've read a lot of reprints of the EC comics from the 50s, and enjoyed them, but it's all a blur in my mind, which is which, Amazing Science Fantasy or, can't even think of the titles of them. But I love a lot of those, a lot of the individual stories from back then. 1960s, I think I'd have to choose the Fantastic Four. They just seem to define the 60s comics. 1970s is where it gets really hard. I think there was a lot of interesting branchings off in the 70s. But if I have to choose one thing, I guess, let's say all the Fourth World comics by Jack Kirby. Those were just in the early 70s. So I feel in a way, since it was such a short-run series, that's kind of cheating. But it's hard to choose just one thing from the 70s, as I've said. Jim Starlin did a lot of great work in the 70s. Lots of beautiful comic book art by John Buscema. Let's see, and then the 80s. I think Frank Miller's Daredevil was from the 80s. Let me see here. 1981 is the issue of Daredevil I have right in front of me. So in a lot of ways, that's the defining series, Frank Miller's Daredevil from the 80s for me. The 90s, I feel like there might be something else, but the first thing that comes to mind is Neil Gaiman's Sandman series. That's real. I think that was mostly in the 90s, and that is really kind of the defining series for the 90s for me. Although there was a period where I just loved the Wolverine in the 90s. But yeah, that's faded. So when you really look back on it, it's Neil Gaiman's decade. The 2000s, off the top of my head, Planetary, because that was a big comic book for me. There's lots of other great stuff. Was The Authority then, or was that in the 90s? The Authority was amazing. So if I research stuff more. And then in this new decade that we're in, what do you call it? The teens, the 2000 teens. So far, if I weren't talking for me personally, I think this is so far looking like the decade of Scott Snyder. But anyone could take over from him. Scott Snyder's current run in Batman, particularly. But for me personally, so far this decade, I think my favorite comic book would be the first 10 issues of Wonder Woman and the New 52. Although I'm very afraid those will suddenly become crappy or something. So we'll have to see. Okay, it's getting late at night, and I feel like I'm starting to get sleepy and more droney on you. It's a good reason I call myself Sleepy Reader, although I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that. I had to add the 666 on the end because apparently there already was another Sleepy Reader. I should look and see if they actually made any videos. Captain Cummings asks, how do you search for comics? For example, I look on eBay, Craigslist, comic shops, and conventions. Do you have any other ways that I didn't mention? Probably not. I've been doing things online, so I've done some eBay, and I've done eBay a long time ago in the past, and I feel like that's kind of hit or miss. I'm not totally happy with doing eBay. I did a haul from Nucadia, which I was pretty happy with, and I'm waiting on a haul from Midtown Comics. Some of those were cheaper than I could get them on Nucadia. So far, it hasn't arrived yet, so it's much slower than Nucadia, and I'll have to see what I think about the condition and everything. So far, Nucadia has been my best experience, although I also had a good experience on something called Your Comic Book Shop, which I picked up the idea of that from a Comic Book Mom. Oh, and you know what? When I was asked about who I watch as reviewers, there were a lot of people I didn't mention. I'm sorry to interrupt in the middle of my answering your questions, Captain Cummings. But a Comic Book Mom is a great reviewer, and I really love her her reviews. And did I not mention Captain Cummings? I always watch Captain Cummings reviews, with or without Dr. Rockstar. So, I like these people I like all of you guys who give nice, honest, real reviews, and it's really helpful to me. Sorry, Captain Cummings. So I was in the middle of your question. So I've tried eBay. I haven't even tried Craigslist. I have a lot of comic book shops here in Portland, Oregon, where I live. So yes, I've gone on and off to comic book shops. I feel like a long time ago, I used to stumble across people just with a box of comics out in a store somewhere, but I haven't found that lately. And I have never bought comics at conventions, to my memory. So that's probably a good place to buy comics that I haven't tried. So I think you've tried more than I have. I've never tried Craigslist. I've occasionally looked at people's ads, but they just seem like a mess, and you can't tell. It would be so hard to figure out whether what they have is worth buying. But as I've sort of restarted as a collector very recently, there's a lot for me to try. I wonder. No, I guess the internet would have replaced. It used to be there were magazines where people would actually list comics for sale, but that's probably long gone. So anyway, yeah, I need to find more ways. So I can't help you, Captain Cummings. And then he also says, when are you going to be on an episode of Comic Talk? And I listen to Comic Talk a lot, Captain Cummings, and I would like to be on it sometime. I guess I have to learn. I have to get a Skype account. I had a Skype account a long time ago, so I have to figure out what my old Skype account was, or start a new Skype account, and then learn what time you guys do it, and see if I can actually make that work. My weekends are very busy. I kind of take over as the primary parent on the weekends. But it's quite possible that I could do an episode of Comic Talk. I'd love to chat with you guys. MAW00001, who's also a very good comic book reviewer. I feel terrible. I shouldn't have even answered Agent 42Q's question about comic book reviews, because I listen to and like so many comic book reviewers. So MAW00001 is a charming and wonderfully interesting raconteur about comics and/or reviewer about comic books. And he asks, if you were on a deserted island and you could only take 3 comic books with you, be they single issue, a whole series, or whatever, which 3 would you want to be with you? Well, if I were being practical, I would pick series, of course, long series. So I would pick the entire Fantastic Four run and the entire Batman run. And the entire Spirit run. So that kind of covers ground I've already covered. Individual issues. Like I might pick, I don't know the particular issues because I can't get off the top of my head, but I might pick a Neil Adams Dead Man, and I might pick something from maybe Jim Starlin's Warlock. So I'm sorry, I can't. I'd have to spend some time researching what the individual issues are. I don't have favorite individual issues off the top of my head. I might pick I might pick like OMAC #1. So let's say those are the 3 individual issues I'd take to a desert island. If you could meet anyone from a comic book, what would you ask them? I'd love to meet Dr. Doom. This is presuming he doesn't kill me. And I would ask him to explain to me exactly what he would like to do with the world once he rules it. Maybe there's a comic book out there that shows Doctor Doom ruling the world. If there is, I've missed it. Maybe there's a what if. It'd be great that maybe there's a whole miniseries out there. Dr. Doom, I guess I could have, for Ghost Critic's question about your favorite character, I could have said Dr. Doom. Brilliant character. So anyhow, I think that's all my questions that I have. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to everyone who leaves comments. You make this so much fun. Thanks to everyone who makes videos. You guys really make it fun, and you really inspire me, and you really help me enjoy comic books more and find more and more good comic books to read. It's kind of like an explosion in my head watching everyone's videos and getting more and more exciting comic book ideas to read. And I think it's just great that readers are communicating with each other. I mentioned earlier about some experience in the world of science fiction writing, and I would say that from what I know, all the professional reviewing in science fiction is questionable. And so I assume it is professional reviewing in comics are questionable too. People are friends with people, or they hope to have a career other than writing reviews in the industry, and so there's a certain sucking up going. So it's a very, the reviewing industry, such as it is, because there's not a lot of money in it anyway, but it's a very questionable industry that often does not serve readers well. So readers should serve each other. And I think that's what we all do very well. So I look forward to everyone's reviews and just general comic book thoughts, sharing their collections. Just everybody keep doing what you're doing. If you're not doing it yet and you are tempted to, I say do it. So talk to you all later.